He thought humiliating her would entertain the entire restaurant, but he had no idea he was about to destroy his own reputation. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to Emily Carter. The dining room of Brooks and Blade glowed under warm golden lights, crystal glasses catching reflections like quiet applause waiting to happen. At the center of it all stood Chef Daniel Brooks, a man whose name carried weight in every corner of the culinary world, his tailored white jacket spotless, his voice sharp, precise, and impossible to ignore. Staff moved quickly around him, careful, almost cautious, because in his kitchen, perfection wasn't expected, it was demanded. And then there was Emily Carter, standing near the back, partially hidden behind stacks of plates and steam from the dish station. She looked like someone who didn't belong in a place like this. Her uniform was simple, slightly faded, her hair tied back without much thought, her presence so quiet it was almost invisible. Most people didn't notice her. Daniel Brooks did, but not in the way that earns respect. To him, she was just another pair of hands, another replaceable worker, someone who stayed in the background where she belonged. Or so he believed. The night had been building toward something important. A VIP guest had just arrived, someone whose opinion could shift headlines, influence ratings, and elevate reputations overnight. The tension in the kitchen thickened like a reduction left on heat too long. Every plate mattered. Every detail counted. And when one of his line cooks froze under pressure, Daniel saw an opportunity. Not to fix the problem, but to make a point. His eyes scanned the room before landing on Emily. A faint smirk curled at the corner of his lips. "You," he called out, his voice cutting through the clatter of pans and low murmurs. The room shifted. Conversations paused. Heads turned. Emily looked up slowly, unsure if he really meant her. "Yes, you," he repeated, louder this time, stepping closer. "Grab an apron. Let's see what the dishwasher can do." A few nervous chuckles broke out among the staff. No one dared to speak against him. In this kitchen, you didn't challenge the chef. You watched. You followed. Or you left. Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the sink. The water continued to run, steady, indifferent, as if the world hadn't just shifted around her. Then, without a word, she turned it off. The sudden silence of the faucet felt louder than any shout. She dried her hands slowly, deliberately, each movement calm, controlled. There was no anger on her face. No embarrassment. Just a stillness that didn't quite match the situation. Daniel noticed, but misunderstood it. To him, it looked like hesitation. Weakness. Exactly what he expected. He tossed an apron toward her, the fabric landing lightly against her hands. "Don't worry," he added, his tone dripping with amusement, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "This is just for entertainment." More laughter, a little louder this time. The kind that fills a room when people don't want to be the next target. Emily slipped the apron on, tying it neatly behind her back. Her eyes lifted, meeting the stainless steel counters, the organized chaos of the kitchen, the heat lamps glowing above the pass. For a brief moment, something shifted in her gaze, something deeper, sharper, almost familiar. But it passed so quickly no one caught it. Or maybe they weren't looking closely enough. Daniel stepped aside, gesturing toward the station. "Go ahead," he said. "Impress us." The room leaned in, waiting for the inevitable mistake, the awkward movement, the confirmation of everything they already believed. Emily walked forward, calm, measured, silent. And as her fingers hovered over the ingredients, the noise of the kitchen began to fade, replaced by something else entirely. Something no one in that room was prepared to witness. Emily's fingers did not rush. They hovered for a fraction of a second above the ingredients, as if listening to something no one else could hear, then moved with quiet certainty. She reached for a pan, not the one closest to her, but the one slightly worn at the edge, the kind seasoned chefs favored without ever explaining why. The flame rose beneath it with a soft blue glow, steady and controlled. Around her, the kitchen noise continued, but it no longer felt the same. Conversations became whispers. Movement slowed. Something subtle had shifted, though no one could yet explain it. Daniel leaned against the counter with his arms crossed, watching with mild amusement, expecting hesitation, expecting mistakes. But there were none. Emily's knife touched the cutting board, and the rhythm that followed was not loud, not flashy, but precise in a way that drew attention without asking for it. Each slice was even, deliberate, almost effortless. One of the line cooks nearby stopped mid-motion, his eyes narrowing slightly as he watched her technique. That was not how beginners held a knife. That was not how someone inexperienced moved. Emily did not look up. She did not acknowledge the room. Her focus stayed on the ingredients, on the balance, on something deeper than the task itself. She reached for herbs, adjusting them without measuring, her instincts guiding her more accurately than any scale. A faint aroma began to rise from the pan, subtle at first, then slowly unfolding into something richer, more complex. It caught the attention of a server passing by, who paused just long enough to glance over, confused by the unexpected shift in scent. Daniel's smirk remained, but it tightened slightly at the edges. He stepped closer, just a few inches, enough to observe more carefully. He told himself he was simply supervising. That was his role. But there was a flicker of something else beneath that thought, something he chose to ignore. Emily adjusted the heat without looking at the dial, her hand moving instinctively, as if she already knew exactly where it needed to be. The sauce in the pan responded immediately, thickening at the perfect pace, not too fast, not too slow. She tilted the pan gently, watching how it moved, how it breathed. It was not cooking. It was control. The room grew quieter, not silent, but close enough that the smallest sounds became noticeable. The soft sizzle, the faint tap of metal against ceramic, the steady rhythm of someone completely at ease in a place where she was never meant to belong. Daniel's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his arms uncrossed, his head tilted slightly. He opened his mouth, as if to say something, then stopped. For the first time, he was not entirely sure what he was watching. Emily plated the dish with the same calm precision. No hesitation, no second-guessing. The components came together in a way that felt intentional, balanced, almost artistic without trying to be. She wiped the edge of the plate clean with a folded cloth, a small detail that most people overlooked, but one that spoke volumes to those who understood. One of the younger cooks glanced at another, their expressions uncertain, as if silently asking the same question. Who is she? Daniel stepped closer now, no longer leaning back, no longer relaxed. His eyes scanned the plate, searching for flaws, for something to confirm his original assumption. But nothing stood out. Nothing was wrong. And that, more than anything, unsettled him. Emily stepped back, her hands resting lightly at her sides. She did not present the dish with pride. She did not seek approval. She simply waited. The server approached, hesitating for a brief moment before taking the plate, as if sensing the weight of something unspoken. Across the dining room, the VIP guest sat beneath the warm lights, unaware that the next few seconds would change everything. The plate was set down gently in front of him. A pause followed, a quiet, almost invisible pause. Then he picked up his fork. Back in the kitchen, no one moved. No one spoke. Daniel's gaze remained fixed, his confidence no longer as solid as it had been just minutes ago. Because somewhere between the first cut and the final plating, something had gone terribly wrong. Or perhaps, for the first time, something had gone completely beyond his control. The fork touched the plate, and in that exact moment, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The VIP guest, a man known for his sharp opinions and even sharper standards, studied the dish for a brief second, his expression unreadable. Then he took a bite. Back in the kitchen, the air tightened. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the low hum of equipment felt distant, as if the world had narrowed to that single reaction. Daniel watched closely, his jaw set, waiting for the inevitable. A slight frown, a polite nod, something that would confirm what he already believed. But it did not come. Instead, the man froze. Not dramatically, not loudly, just still. His fork paused halfway back to the plate, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in disapproval, but in focus. He took another bite, slower this time, as if trying to understand something. That did not immediately make sense. A server nearby shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to step in or step back. At another table, A couple lowered their voices, sensing the change in atmosphere without knowing why. And then, the man set his fork down. Carefully, deliberately. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling once, not out of disappointment, but out of recognition. Back in the kitchen, Daniel felt something unfamiliar press against his confidence. It was small at first, a flicker, but it grew with every second of silence stretching across the dining room. He took a step forward, as if getting closer would somehow give him control over what was happening. It did not. The guest raised his hand slightly, signaling the server. Not urgently, not angrily. Calm, controlled. The kind of gesture that carried weight without needing volume. "Who made this?" he asked, his voice steady, but carrying clearly across the space. The question moved through the room like a ripple. The server hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen, toward Daniel, toward the unspoken hierarchy that dictated every answer. Daniel straightened instinctively, ready to claim authority, ready to step into the moment he believed belonged to him. But something stopped him. Not a sound, not a word, just a quiet awareness that this moment was no longer his to control. The server turned slightly, her eyes landing on Emily, who stood exactly where she had been, calm, still, almost untouched by the tension surrounding her. "She did," the server said, her voice softer now, but unmistakable. The guest's gaze shifted. Slowly, deliberately. It landed on Emily, studying her not as staff, not as background, but as something else entirely. Something worth understanding. He stood up. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but with purpose. Conversations around the room faded, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than noise. He took a few steps toward the kitchen, each one measured, each one drawing more attention. Daniel felt it then, clearly now. The shift, the loss of control, the unraveling of something he had built his identity around. The man stopped just at the edge of the kitchen entrance, his eyes never leaving Emily. "How long have you been cooking?" he asked. It was a simple question, but it did not feel simple. Emily met his gaze, her expression steady, her posture unchanged. For a brief moment, the room seemed to lean in, waiting for her answer, expecting hesitation, expecting uncertainty. But there was none. "Long enough," she said quietly. The words were soft, but they carried a weight that settled into the room, into the walls, into the space between every person standing there. Daniel let out a small breath, one he did not realize he had been holding. His mind searched for explanations, for reasons, for anything that could bring this moment back into something familiar. But nothing came, because what stood in front of him was not a mistake. It was not luck. It was not an accident. It was something far more unsettling, something precise, something intentional. And as the silence deepened, one truth began to take shape in a way he could no longer ignore. He had not just underestimated her. He had misjudged everything. The silence did not break, it deepened. It settled into the kitchen like a weight no one knew how to lift. Chef Daniel Brooks stood still, his usual authority slipping through his fingers in a way he had never experienced before. The VIP guest's eyes remained on Emily, not with curiosity anymore, but with recognition, the kind that only came from years of refined taste and quiet observation. "Long enough," he repeated softly, almost to himself, as if testing the truth behind her words. Then he took a step closer, crossing the invisible line that separated the dining room from the kitchen, a line that guests rarely crossed. The staff instinctively moved aside, creating space without being told. Respect, real respect, had entered the room, and it did not belong to Daniel anymore. Emily did not step back. She did not straighten her posture to impress. She simply stood there, calm, grounded, as if she had been in this exact moment before. Daniel finally found his voice, though it did not carry the same sharp edge it once did. "It was a simple dish," he said, attempting to regain control, attempting to frame the situation into something smaller, something manageable. But even as the words left his mouth, they felt thin. The guest turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge Daniel without fully giving him attention. "There is nothing simple about balance," he replied evenly. The statement landed quietly, but its impact was immediate. A few of the cooks exchanged glances, their earlier amusement completely gone. Daniel's jaw tightened. He was not used to being corrected, especially not in his own kitchen. Emily reached for a clean towel and folded it with precise, practiced movements, as if the tension around her had nothing to do with her at all. The guest watched her hands, not her face, noticing the way she handled even the smallest action with intention. "You trained in Europe," he said suddenly. It was not a question. It was a conclusion. Emily paused for just a fraction of a second, then continued folding the towel. "For a while," she answered. Again, simple. Again, controlled. But this time, the room felt the shift more clearly. Europe. That word alone carried weight in a kitchen like this. It meant discipline. It meant tradition. It meant standards that did not tolerate mediocrity. Daniel stepped forward, unable to ignore it anymore. "Where?" he asked, sharper now, needing specifics, needing something he could measure, something he could challenge. Emily looked at him then, really looked at him for the first time since he had called her out. Her eyes were steady, not confrontational, but not submissive either. "Paris," she said. One word, but it landed like a quiet reveal of something much larger beneath the surface. A low murmur moved through the staff, barely audible, but impossible to miss. Daniel felt it, the subtle shift in how people stood, how they looked at her, how they looked at him. Authority was not declared in that moment. It was transferred. The guest gave a small nod, as if a piece of a puzzle had just clicked into place. "That explains the restraint," he said. "And the confidence." Daniel opened his mouth again, but no words came. Because for the first time, he realized he was no longer the one being observed as the expert. He was the one being measured. Emily turned slightly, reaching for another plate, not to prove anything, not to continue the performance, but simply because the night was still moving, orders still needed to be filled, and she understood something Daniel had forgotten. The work always came first. "Make another one," the guest said, his voice calm, but carrying a quiet authority of its own. It was not a request. It was a test, the kind that separated curiosity from certainty. Emily nodded once, not eager, not hesitant, just ready. And as she moved back to the station, the room shifted again. This time not in doubt, but in anticipation. Because whatever Daniel thought he had started as a joke had just become something else entirely. And deep down, he knew it was no longer under his control. Emily did not rush the second dish. If anything, she slowed down. The kitchen watched more closely now, not with amusement, but with a kind of quiet tension that settled into every corner of the room. This was no longer entertainment. This was evaluation. The flame came alive again beneath the pan, but softer this time, controlled with a precision that felt almost deliberate, as if she was showing them something without saying a word. Her hands moved with the same calm rhythm, but there was an added layer now, something deeper, something intentional. She was not just cooking, she was revealing. Daniel stood a few feet away, no longer leaning, no longer relaxed. His posture had stiffened, his eyes locked onto every movement she made. He searched for mistakes, for inconsistencies, for anything that could bring this moment back into something familiar. But again, there were none. Emily adjusted seasoning without tasting, her instincts guiding her with a confidence that did not need validation. The ingredients came together differently this time, not a repetition of the first dish, but a variation, more refined, more daring in its balance. A few staff members exchanged glances, their earlier skepticism replaced by something closer to unease. Because now it was undeniable. This was not luck. This was mastery. The sound of the pan shifted, the subtle change in heat creating a deeper tone, one that experienced cooks recognized instantly. Emily tilted the pan slightly, watching how the sauce responded, how it thickened at exactly the right moment. She did not hesitate. She did not second-guess. Every movement carried certainty. The kind of certainty that only came from years of experience no one in that room had witnessed. The guest remained at the edge of the kitchen, his attention unwavering. He was not watching for entertainment anymore. He was studying. And the more he watched, the more his expression changed, not in surprise, but in confirmation. Daniel swallowed slowly, the confidence he once carried now replaced by something heavier. Doubt. Not loud, not obvious, but present. He stepped closer again, this time not to assert control, but to understand what he had missed. Emily plated the second dish with even greater restraint. No unnecessary decoration. No excess. Just balance. Precision. Intent. She wiped the rim of the plate again, the same small gesture that now felt like a signature rather than a habit. The server approached, but hesitated, glancing briefly at Daniel as if asking for permission. Daniel did not respond. For the first time, he did not know what to say. The plate was taken, carried out, and once again, the kitchen followed it in silence. Seconds stretched longer than they should have. The guest returned to his table, sat down slowly, and looked at the dish with a different kind of focus. Not curiosity, recognition. He took a bite. This time, there was no pause. No hesitation. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in confusion, but in certainty. When he opened them again, something had changed completely. Back in the kitchen, the silence broke not with noise, but with realization. The guest stood up again, more decisively this time, and walked back toward the kitchen without waiting. Conversations in the dining room faded entirely. All attention shifted. He stopped in front of Emily, closer now than before, his presence carrying a quiet authority that matched hers. Daniel stood just behind him, no longer leading, no longer directing, just there, watching. The guest spoke, his voice low, but clear enough for everyone to hear. 3 kitchens, he said slowly. Paris, Lyon, and Marseille. The words landed one by one, each heavier than the last. Emily did not react outwardly, but her stillness said everything. Daniel's breath caught. The room felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves were listening. The guest nodded once, as if confirming what he already knew. I have eaten in all of them, he continued. And this, he gestured lightly toward the space, toward the station, toward her, is the same hand. The room went completely silent. Not uncertain silence. Not curious silence. Final silence. Because in that moment, the truth was no longer hidden. And Daniel Brooks realized something he had never faced before. He had not just underestimated a woman. He had just challenged someone who had already mastered everything he was still trying to prove. The words did not echo, but they did not need to. They settled into the room with a quiet finality that no one could ignore. 3 kitchens. Paris, Lyon, Marseille. The names alone carried more weight than any title Daniel Brooks had ever introduced himself with. For a moment, no one moved. Not the cooks, not the servers, not even the hum of the kitchen seemed to continue the same way. It was as if the entire space had recalibrated around a truth that had been invisible just minutes ago. Daniel felt it most of all. The shift was no longer subtle. It was complete. His gaze moved from the guest to Emily, searching for something, anything that might contradict what had just been said. But there was nothing. No denial. No explanation. Just that same calm presence she had carried from the beginning. The kind of calm that did not need to prove itself. Why are you here? Daniel finally asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of the sharpness that once defined it. It was not an accusation. It was confusion. Real, unfiltered confusion. Because nothing about this made sense to him. Someone with that level of experience, that level of recognition, did not stand at a dish station in a restaurant like his. They did not remain invisible. They did not stay silent. Emily looked at him, not with resentment, not with satisfaction, but with a steady clarity that felt almost disarming. Because I wanted to remember what it feels like to work without being known, she said. The answer was simple, but it landed deeper than anything else that had been said that night. A few staff members shifted slightly, their expressions changing as they processed her words. For them, the kitchen had always been a place to prove themselves, to be seen, to climb. But for her, it had become something else entirely. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time, he realized that everything he valued in that space, the recognition, the authority, the reputation, meant nothing to someone who had already reached beyond it. The guest stepped back slightly, giving the moment room to breathe, but his presence still anchored the silence. You stepped away, he said, not as a question, but as an understanding. Emily nodded once. For a while. No explanation followed. None was needed. Because the room could feel it now. This was not someone chasing validation. This was someone who had already defined it. Daniel glanced around his kitchen, at the staff who once looked to him for direction, for approval. Their attention had shifted, not dramatically, not openly, but undeniably. They were looking at her differently now. And by extension, they were looking at him differently too. The authority he had relied on was no longer absolute. It had been challenged, not through confrontation, but through presence. Emily untied the apron slowly, her movements as deliberate as everything else she had done that night. She folded it neatly and placed it on the counter, returning it to exactly where it had been before. The gesture was small, but it carried a quiet finality. She was not reclaiming anything. She was simply stepping away from something she had never needed. "The kitchen is yours," she said, her voice calm, almost gentle. But the words did not feel like surrender. They felt like a choice. Daniel looked at the apron, then back at her, his mind struggling to hold on to something solid, something familiar. "No," he said, the word coming out before he fully understood it. "It is not the same anymore." The admission hung in the air, raw and unpolished. It was not loud, but it was real. Emily did not respond immediately. She studied him for a brief moment, not judging, not measuring, just seeing him as he was in that moment. Then she gave a small nod, acknowledging something unspoken between them. The guest watched quietly, a faint expression of approval crossing his face, not for the situation, but for what it revealed. Growth rarely arrived comfortably, and tonight, it had arrived without warning. Emily turned slightly, preparing to leave the station, to return to the quiet anonymity she had chosen. But as she took her first step, the room remained still. Because even though she was walking away, something she had revealed could not be undone. Not for the staff, not for the guest, and certainly not for Daniel Brooks. Because in a single night, without raising her voice, without demanding recognition, she had done something far more powerful. She had redefined what true mastery looked like, and the room would not forget it. Emily's footsteps were quiet, but every step echoed in a way that no sound could explain. She moved away from the station, past the polished steel counters, past the line cooks who once barely noticed her, and now could not look away. No one stopped her. No one spoke. The kitchen, once filled with direction and command, had become something else entirely. It had become reflective. Daniel stood where he was, his hands resting lightly against the counter, not out of control, but out of thought. For the first time in years, he was not thinking about the next dish, the next order, or the next expectation. He was thinking about something far more uncomfortable. Himself. Around him, the staff slowly began to move again, but their rhythm had changed. It was more deliberate now, less mechanical, as if each action carried more awareness than before. A young cook glanced at the station Emily had just left, then adjusted his own plating with more care than he had earlier. Another wiped the edge of a plate twice instead of once, not because he was told to, but because he had seen what precision looked like when it was done without ego. The guest remained near the entrance, watching quietly, his presence no longer disruptive, but grounding. He had seen this before, not in kitchens, but in moments where truth revealed itself without warning. Daniel finally exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his shoulders in a way that felt unfamiliar. He turned his head slightly, his eyes following Emily as she reached the edge of the kitchen, where the noise softened and the anonymity she had chosen waited for her again. "Emily," he called out, not loudly, but clearly enough to stop her. The name felt different now. Not a label, not a role, a recognition. She paused, turning back just enough to meet his gaze. The room stilled again, not out of anticipation, but out of respect for what was about to be said. Daniel stepped forward, closing the distance by a few feet, but not enough to reclaim authority. Just enough to be present. "I was wrong," he said. The words were simple, but they carried a weight far heavier than any command he had ever given. There was no audience in his tone, no performance, no attempt to regain control. Just truth. A few staff members lowered their eyes slightly, not out of discomfort, but out of understanding. Because in a kitchen like this, those words were rare. Emily held his gaze for a moment, her expression unchanged, but softer now in a way that did not weaken her, but humanized the moment. She gave a small nod, acknowledging the honesty without making it larger than it needed to be. "So was I," she replied quietly. The response caught him off guard, not because it challenged him, but because it expanded the moment beyond him. "I thought I could disappear from what I built," she continued, her voice steady, reflective. "But mastery does not disappear. It follows you." The words settled into the room, not as a lesson, but as a realization that everyone could feel in their own way. Daniel looked around his kitchen again, seeing it differently now, not as something he controlled, but as something he shaped, something that reflected not just his skill, but his character. And for the first time, he questioned what that reflection had been. The guest gave a faint nod, satisfied not with the outcome, but with the transformation he had just witnessed. He turned and walked back toward his table, leaving the moment behind as quietly as he had entered it. Emily turned back toward the exit, her path no longer unnoticed, no longer invisible. And as she reached the doorway, something shifted one last time. Not in her, not in the guest, but in Daniel Brooks. Because he did not call her back again. He did not try to hold onto the moment or redefine it. He simply watched, understanding something that had taken him years to reach. Respect was not something you demanded in a kitchen. It was something you earned in silence, in precision, in the way you treated those who stood where you once stood. And as Emily stepped out of sight, the room did not return to what it had been. It moved forward into something better, something quieter, something more honest. And for the first time, Daniel did not feel the need to fill that silence. He understood it. The door closed softly behind Emily, and yet her presence did not leave the room. It lingered in the air, in the way the kitchen breathed, in the way every movement now carried intention instead of habit. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then slowly, almost cautiously, the rhythm of the restaurant returned. Orders resumed. Plates moved. But something fundamental had changed. Daniel Brooks stood still at the center of it all, not issuing commands, not correcting, not controlling. He watched, really watched. A line cook adjusted his seasoning, pausing before adding salt, thinking instead of reacting. Another slowed down her plating, aligning each element with care rather than speed. These were small changes, barely noticeable to an outsider, but inside that kitchen, they meant everything. Because they were no longer working out of fear of correction. They were working out of awareness. Daniel took a slow breath, the kind that settled deeper than usual. He stepped toward the pass, where plates were being prepared for service, and for the first time, he did not immediately point out what was wrong. Instead, he picked up a spoon, tasted a sauce, and paused. Not to criticize, to understand. The flavor was good, but not complete. He adjusted it slightly, not with force, but with intention. One of the cooks watched him closely, expecting the usual sharp comment, the quick judgment. But it did not come. Daniel simply nodded once and moved on. The shift was quiet, but undeniable. In the dining room, the VIP guest sat back at his table, his meal continuing, but his attention still partially anchored in what he had just witnessed. He did not call for Emily again. He did not need to. Some moments were not meant to be repeated. They were meant to be remembered. A server approached him carefully. "Is everything to your satisfaction, sir?" she asked. The question felt different now, more meaningful. The guest gave a small, measured nod. "More than that," he replied. His gaze moved briefly toward the kitchen, toward the place where everything had changed without announcement. "It reminded me what excellence actually looks like." The words were quiet, but they carried. Back in the kitchen, Daniel heard them. Not fully, not clearly, but enough. Enough to understand that the night was no longer about proving anything. It was about something else entirely. He turned toward the staff, his voice steady, but no longer sharp. "Take your time on the next order," he said. The instruction was simple, but it landed differently than anything he had said before. There was no pressure behind it, no hidden threat, just direction. The staff responded without hesitation, but also without fear. And that was new. Minutes passed, and the service continued, smoother now, quieter, more focused. The kitchen had not lost its intensity. It had refined it. Daniel moved through the space with purpose, but not dominance. He corrected when needed, but without humiliation. He guided, but did not overpower. And in doing so, he began to see something he had overlooked for years. The strength of a kitchen was not in how loudly it operated. It was in how precisely it functioned when no one needed to raise their voice. At the far end of the counter, the folded apron Emily had worn remained exactly where she had left it. Untouched, not forgotten, just present. Daniel's eyes lingered on it for a brief moment. He walked over slowly, picking it up with a kind of care that surprised even him. The fabric was simple, ordinary, but tonight, it had carried something extraordinary. He folded it again, more carefully this time, and placed it back down, not as a tool, but as a reminder. The kitchen continued around him, alive, evolving, moving forward. And Daniel understood something he had never fully grasped before. Leadership was not about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about creating a space where excellence could exist without needing to announce itself. And as the night carried on, one truth settled quietly into the foundation of everything he had built. The best lessons were not taught through authority. They were revealed through example. And once seen, they could not be unseen. The night did not end with applause. It ended with something quieter, something far more lasting. Plates continued to leave the kitchen, each one carrying a level of care that had not been there before. The energy of the room had settled into a new rhythm, one that did not rely on pressure or fear, but on intention. Daniel Brooks moved through his kitchen with a different presence now, not diminished, but refined. His voice, when he spoke, no longer cut through the room. It guided, it directed, and more importantly, it listened. The staff responded in kind, their movements sharper, their focus deeper, their confidence no longer dependent on avoiding mistakes, but on understanding the craft itself. The VIP guest finished his meal slowly, thoughtfully, as if he was not just tasting the food, but reflecting on the moment that had transformed the entire space. When he stood to leave, he paused near the kitchen entrance one last time. His eyes moved briefly across the room, taking in the subtle changes, the quiet evolution that had taken place in a matter of hours. He did not look for Emily again. He did not need to. Some people do not leave impressions. They leave standards. And standards, once raised, do not fall easily. Daniel noticed him, stepped forward slightly, but did not speak. There was nothing to prove anymore. The guest gave a small nod, not as a farewell, but as acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked out, leaving behind a silence that felt different from before. Not heavy, not uncertain, just clear. The kind of silence that comes after something important has been understood. Back in the kitchen, the final orders of the night were completed with care. No one rushed. No one cut corners. Even the smallest details were handled with a level of respect that had not existed at the start of the evening. Daniel returned to the station where it had all begun. The folded apron was still there, waiting, not as a reminder of embarrassment, but as a symbol of something much larger. He picked it up again, holding it for a brief moment, then placed it back down with the same care he had shown earlier. Not because it was valuable in itself, but because of what it represented. A lesson, a shift, a truth he could not ignore. One of the younger cooks approached cautiously. "Chef," he said, his voice respectful, but not fearful. Was she really? He did not finish the question. He did not need to. Daniel looked at him, then at the rest of the kitchen, at the people who had witnessed something they would carry with them long after this night ended. "Yes," Daniel said simply. No elaboration. No explanation. Just truth. The cook nodded slowly, absorbing it, then returned to his station, his movements more deliberate than before. The kitchen began to close down, lights dimming slightly, the intensity of service giving way to the quiet of reflection. Outside, the city continued as it always did, unaware of what had shifted inside those walls. But inside, nothing was the same. Daniel stood alone for a moment, the noise of the kitchen fading into the background. He looked around, not with ownership, but with understanding. For years, he had believed that control defined excellence, that authority ensured respect, that recognition proved mastery. But tonight had shown him something different, something quieter, something far more difficult to earn. True mastery did not need to announce itself. It revealed itself in silence, in precision, in the way it transformed everything around it without force. Emily had not argued. She had not defended herself. She had not demanded acknowledgement. She had simply shown what was real. And in doing so, she had changed more than just a single night. She had changed the standard by which everything in that kitchen would now be measured. Daniel took one last look at the station, at the space where it had all unfolded, then turned off the final light. The room dimmed, settling into stillness, but not emptiness. Because what had been revealed there would remain. Not in noise, not in memory alone, but in every action that followed. Respect is always revealed when you least expect it. If you believe in stories that uncover truth and dignity, hit like and subscribe because the next story might change the way you see the world. Thank you for watching.